Welcome to the Popcorn Talk Network, for the online broadcast network that features movie discussion, news, and interviews. Press 1. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
I'm opening. We have an eye, sort of a nostril, 2 teeth. One of the teeth has a small cavity. Close call, folks, but I think we got here just in time.
Presented by Maria Menounos and Kevin Undergaro. This is Anatomy of a Movie. In-depth discussions and breakdowns of various movie titles. And now that you've seen the movie, let the dissection begin.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Let the dissection begin. Today we're, of course, talking about Risen, the 2016 biblical epic directed by Kevin Reynolds. Came out last week, February 19th, with a budget of $20 million. We have Jeff Graham.
What's up, everyone? Jeff Graham here. Please follow me on Twitter at Jeffrey C. Graham, and you can follow me on Instagram at Jeffrey Crane Graham. That's
right. He is the scheduling coordinator of all of these shows that we do here. And also, I might add, a young, you can't say aspiring, but a budding writer.
Yeah, I've got some news for you about a script that I'll have to tell you after the show.
Oh, will you? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Definitely.
Looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
Question mark. And we have Marisa Serafini.
Hello, everyone.
Graphic designer and senior producer over here at AfterBuzz TV and Popcorn Talk.
Yes, and a Catholic. So I feel like my voice is definitely needed on this panel, especially for this one.
And Jeff, you're of religious descent.
Indeed. I would describe myself as a non-denominational Christian, but I certainly know this story, so I'm excited to speak on it.
Fair enough. And I'm your host, Phil Svitek. Thank you guys for joining us. It's a pleasure being here. And you know what? I got to say, first and foremost, we always do quick impressions. And so, for me, what I liked about it was that it took this story, and now, whatever you believe, I think it really kind of bridges that gap for believers and non-believers, and takes whatever miracles there are, takes a secular approach to it all. And it doesn't necessarily try to explain. It just lets it be. And then you make up your ultimate decision. And I thought the movie did that really well. I thought it was very fast, very quick, and just did its job, did what it set out to do. And I commend it for that, truly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting, especially, growing up and always being surrounded by religion and different takes and revisions and just different people's productions of the same story over and over and over and told in different ways. And what I appreciated about this film was that it is a story that we know what happened from Jesus' death to his resurrection to ascension, and it's been told a million times. But what I liked was
but not as much as the crucifixion.
Not as much as the crucifixion. But what I liked about the story in this film is that they showed it in a different perspective, a perspective that us in today's society in the 21st century, we haven't seen this type of perspective telling the story. And I thought that was very creative and went in different ways and generated different opinions from people who might have gotten something else had it been told in this same straightforward way if it was told through Jesus' eyes or Yahshua's eyes or Mary Magdalene's or all the apostles. It was told from a very distinct perspective that I felt was so broad to everybody. And I really did enjoy that for this film.
Yeah, I agree. I actually just saw the movie, and I liked it a lot. I wasn't sure if I liked it because it resonated with me personally or if I liked it because it was a good movie, so it's nice to hear that you guys liked it as well. I do think I had a couple narrative issues with the movie that I'm excited to talk about, but overall, I agree with you, Marisa. It was a fresh approach to the resurrection, and I don't think it was too pandering or too heavy-handed, which is always something you fear with religious movies. So,
yeah, and before we kind of get into it, there's an interesting comparison to be made, and people have already made it online, that Hail Caesar came out just recently, and that was about, that was about kind of the process of making an epic in the 1950s. And where Jesus in that movie wasn't a prevalent character, so much so like, do you get a box lunch or do you get just the
regular lunch?
And I like that aspect of it, that in this movie, Jesus is obviously central to all this, and certainly towards the end of the movie, but it's, as you mentioned, Marisa, it's not necessarily about him. And again, I just like that comparison. I mean, it's timing coincidence that the two came out fairly together, but it was a fun thing to make. So check out Hail Caesar, which has nothing ultimately to do with religion whatsoever. So let's talk about this is the resurrection story, and originally I was trying to dig deeper as to why it ultimately ended up being called Risen, but originally it was supposed to be called Resurrection. So
I think Risen just goes with the concept that is the whole mystery story narrative that's going on in the film. It's like, did he really rise and resurrect from the dead? Because that would show action to someone who's supposed to be inactive, and I think it adds an active voice to a story that they're trying to figure out. So I think it shows something that's actually going on.
I'm sure the studio was more on board with Risen versus Resurrection too, just because it wasn't so religiously loaded. Like, I feel like for people who are turned off by religious movies, they'd rather go see a movie called Risen than Resurrection, I bet.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Well, fair enough. And the whole concept of this, a couple of things came into play, right? They wanted to take this idea of resurrection and almost make a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. And they've said it multiple times, and I don't really consider them a sequel, with the exception of that.
I would say it's a companion rather than a sequel, because in The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's famous movie, it ends, literally the last shot is Jesus looks into the light and walks out, and that's where it ends. And if you take it from the beginning of this film, that's where the film starts. So I can see where people are making that comparison and making that connection between these two.
Here's what
I call it a companion. I would say it's a continuation.
Well, it's part of a marketing campaign more so than anything.
It's a continuation.
We've got to call it's the spiritual successor to Passion of the Christ, because that works on so many levels.
Fair enough.
But would you go see a film called Spiritual Successor?
Oh no, I mean, just in terms of the idea of it's like the companion is more what I'm saying.
It's a companion.
Yeah.
But beyond that fun little kind of marketing ploy, ultimately it came down to, what if it was like Gladiator in tone, but with a mystery bend, and that basically showed how Easter really came to be. And so I mentioned my quick thoughts. That as a core idea, I thought came across really well. I thought ultimately it was exactly like that. And for a story developed by Paul Abiello, who basically has no credits to his name whatsoever, and then Kevin Reynolds, who we'll talk about. Kevin Reynolds is not the biggest Hollywood name when you compare it to some, let's say, like Steven Spielberg, but he's got a wealth of history that we will certainly get into, and so I think they were able to develop something great together.
Yeah, speaking of the idea of telling the Easter story, one thing I loved about this movie is that it wasn't afraid to explore the nitty gritty and kind of the the idea is that this was a revolutionary moment in terms of the birth of the Christian church. And I think what happens with holidays, any holidays, whatever, if you're Jewish, Hanukkah, Christian, Christmas, whatever, I think the impact of what the actual story of the holiday is gets reduced through time and kind of whitewashed. So this movie really shows us that Easter isn't about a bunny, that's what's happened with the commercialization of Easter, but it really was a revolutionary time in the history of Christianity. So
and the interesting thing with this film, it wasn't the celebration more so, because during the Easter time, the day of resurrection, it was all about Clavius actually just still trying to find bodies. We didn't get a family dynamic where everyone's celebrating something joyful in that way.
Right.
It was, again, through our main protagonist of the film.
Right, this was a high stakes.
It's not the conventional Easter that we as an audience know Easter to be.
Right.
Let me ask you this, because it was based on The Robe, which was a novel, and then in 1953 was made into a movie, which kind of has similar beats of this. Now, I've never seen this movie. First off, I've never even really heard of the movie until I did the research, but I wanted to know if you guys did and what you guys thought of that.
I do not know.
Unfortunately, I have not seen The Robe.
Fair enough. Well, and that is kind of the neat part, is that you can, and I kind of knew that the answer would be no.
Right.
So the idea, what I like about that is so many things get kind of remade in different ways, and what I like is that, especially this type of subject, you can kind of almost go limitless with it and be able to retell it in different ways. And again, the level of spirituality or secularism kind of is wherever you want it to be. And I thought, again, without having seen that movie, I thought they did a good job. Yeah. With Risen, ultimately. All right, so since we're talking about story, let's dive in. So I would say the first part is very overall secular, and then finally, once he goes on that journey, Clavius, to really find out the truth about all this, then it goes into those secular elements. And I wanted to kind of using that as a major tone shift. Let's talk about it from a story perspective.
I really enjoyed it because, again, it just goes with what we know from the Bible and the story of Yahshua / Jesus. I think that's a good way to start a film, but that's been told in so many different ways over all these years. It's good to just, again, remind people this is the story that we're talking about. All right, now that that's set up, now this is our new story that we're adding to it. And I think it was a good way to just get everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. Actually, story was the one thing, if I had to make some complaints about this movie, that I would. I kind of thought that there was a huge narrative shift in the movie halfway through that kind of took me out of it. And granted, that's what the intention of the movie was, and that's what they were trying to do, but it kind of felt like once not Pontius, I'm thinking of Tribune. Once Tribune decided to join the disciples and kind of explore this new life with them, we kind of lost the stakes, I thought. And it was interesting to see his experience as a character, but I kind of was having trouble. I think the tension was kind of lost. I mean, it all became internal. I felt like the tension was moved from being this external kind of thriller mystery film to sort of a more internal character study, and that kind of jarred me as a viewer. Even though I still liked this movie, that would kind of be my one complaint.
I mean, I think it is jarring, no different than Psycho literally kills off its main character halfway through the movie. Yeah. And I think it was meant to be. Mm-hmm. But I think from a story structure, they laid out various elements initially into the plot, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the things was, life after death and peace, especially that bathtub scene between Clavius and Pontius. I think that was very telling. It's like, what do you want? Mm-hmm. And he goes on, and he lists hey, I want to do this. Okay, why do you want power? Well, so I can basically have a family and have live on my own. And why do you want that? So I can have peace. And the joke is there no better way to achieve peace? Mm-hmm. And the irony is that here is Yahshua, and if there's a much better way of achieving peace.
Right.
And the nice part about that is, regardless of your spirituality, it seems like a better route than corruption and control and this and that.
Well, I think that idea resonates so strongly because this is the same Jerusalem where there's, core religions battling and fighting, and nothing has changed. If you look at the current state of Middle Eastern religious politics, it's such an inflamed, passionate movement on all. It was interesting because I felt like that resonated very strongly even with today's kind of religious climate in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So absolutely. I don't know, it was cool.
Yeah, I liked the perspective that they said. Yes, I agree with the whole external to internal conflict, but for me, I didn't mind that because in the end, it wasn't really about Jesus.
Right.
It was more about Clavius, and he's the person we're all following. So in a way, I did see his character arc and character change throughout, and I liked that because I went on a journey with him, and Yahshua just happened to be there.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think him as a character, it was smart to make him the focus. I think it was mostly just it was almost more of a tone shift. It was a really action-packed first half, and then it kind of became this quieter character study, which I guess I can see why you would like that. It just didn't necessarily work for me.
Nice.
Well, let me ask you this, because it's very much, it's by design. Clavius is a made-up character.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But I think there is that connection, and, people experience this in different ways, and perhaps there's some people who don't ultimately experience it at all, but the questioning of faith, right? And so here's this guy who goes from a non-believer, and by the end of the movie, you're still not really left with, does he actually believe? Right. All he says is, well, I've changed forever. And so it puts the audience directly in that seat. And what I tout about this movie is that it makes all of these miracles happen in an everyday setting. And there's reasonable doubt on all aspects of it, right? Well, you could say that the guards were drunk, right? That was there.
That was a practical thing. That was like, yeah, I understand how they could slip up during their work, and like, yeah, they could like let people take of the body. I liked how there was a practical reasoning to a more unrevealing situation.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and so I thought that they layered in that nicely. And again, I mean, you guys, if you want, speak to it more so, but I thought as a technique, because certainly for me, I'm not necessarily religious, but that doesn't mean I don't question it. And I thought that was a clever technique because, as I said, no matter how faithful or unfaithful you are, it's a great vehicle to drive through Clavius in this story.
Characters.
Yeah, like to your point, Phil, like speaking as someone who goes to church every week, like I am religious, which doesn't mean I don't question it frequently. You know what I mean? So I did like this movie for that reason because I think I could recommend it to anyone. I wouldn't feel uncomfortable recommending this movie to like an atheist because I didn't think it was really heavy-handed.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
And it wasn't always just hitting you over the head like you have to be Catholic to enjoy this film. You have to be X, Y, and Z to enjoy this film. No. And again, I like the perspective that it was a non-believer because that does, in a way, open the doors to so many non-believers who might not want to see this film. But because it's from a non-believer, they'll connect with the main character and understand and find it relatable and might actually enjoy this film. So I like the fact that we're following a non-believer into his agnostic type of belief at the end.
Yeah. And again, Jeff, it is unconventional in that way, like, because you could say, even by the halfway point in the movie, he's at least, like, you could call that an arc in itself, where going from blind, what his blind faith is like, he's just about action and all this and that, and he doesn't want to even consider any other notions because that's just the way he's been taught in Roman society. And so to go from that arc to just potentially questioning it, right, is ultimately a huge arc. I mean,
definitely.
But the interesting part is, he was, no matter what, we are all faithful to one thing or another. In this case, he was very faithful to the Roman structure of society, and that's what he did, and he exemplified that through his actions.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think that was just, how they built his character, because, again, he is fictionalized. But I like the idea that he's so set in his ways, and he's so high up in military, that he only thinks one way. And then to have something affect his life in such a dramatic way for him to change his ways and change his ways of thinking, that was also fun to watch.
I will say, like, in terms of his character, I was incredibly moved by the scene, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, a little bit, but just to preview.
You can get into it.
The scene where they're trying to find the disciples, and he walks in the room and sees Jesus there. I found that to be a very, very moving scene. Like, just because it was, being from his perspective, the power and, like, the amount that would resonate to see the risen Christ back in that room with the disciples must have been something amazing.
Yeah, and again, it kind of, what's nice about that initially works on that level of, are they tricking me? Because ultimately, yes, he sees the face, but at the end of the day, this is a very clean face that he sees. I mean, to see someone crucified with blood and literally at their worst, to now here he is alive in all sense of the word, and you have that double take of like, wait, are they effing with me? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I did like that because for the short amount of time that Clavius was with Jesus during the crucifixion, it was enough to put it into Clavius's mind, like, this guy is dead. I made the orders to make sure he's officially dead. And then he's, again, going off the tricking. It's like, I can't believe he's alive right in front of me when I saw him die right in front of me. And I really believe that, and I think that's a testament to Joseph Fiennes' acting, too, that I like there was slow movement. Slow-mo can be really cheesy and bad and tacky if done wrong, and I think they did it right in this one because he's literally besides himself. He can't think, and his world stops to the point where what is happening right now? And I thought that was creatively and cleverly shown on the film.
Yeah, and so let's talk about Joseph Fiennes, right? Because let's get him to his acting and as technique. He's been described by Kevin Reynolds, the director. He played both physicality with vulnerability,
Yep.
because he needed both. I mean, he was a soldier. We needed to buy that he can just kick butt, but at the same time, when that turn happens, as jarring as it may be, you do understand it and believe it from his character. So I thought that was, and one of the fun things he says about shooting later on with the apostles was it was like shooting Christmas with 12 lunatics.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. I love Joseph Fiennes. I think he's a great actor in everything that he's done. What I really like the vulnerability to someone who's supposed to be so strong in this film, and I really believed the soft moments, and his whole the moment when he's sitting on the rock with Jesus, and Jesus was like, "Or do you just want a life without death?" And I like, you can see it really hit home with him. He's like, he just wanted a better life with less violence and death, and I believed it, and I felt for him. And for someone who was so merciless at the beginning of the film to someone who really wants nothing to do with the death, therein lies the fun journey going with Joseph Fiennes. And I think that was just great acting on his part. And I'm happy that he played such a great role.
Yeah, and this is a role that could have been boring. Like, if they had cast it wrong, I think, like, the leading man with an internal plight can be, like, a very boring role when it's not played well, and subtle things make it so great. And so I'm really glad they cast him. It's interesting, I noticed he grew up in Cork, and I believe that Saoirse Ronan also grew up in Cork, and I feel like there are, like, vague similarities to her role in Brooklyn to this movie. Maybe in Cork, Ireland, they do a really good job raising the quiet, sensitive actor.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I mean, you are correct that because if you kind of look at it, even though he's progressing in the detective side of the story, the technique is still similar, right? Someone comes into his office, he questions them, and he grows more frustrated because they just seem like at the point in time of the story like lunatics to him. Just they have literal faith and blind faith, and again, you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I don't want to call it blind faith.
No, it's okay.
This podcast is very hard to be choosing your words.
Well, if you think about it, at the time, like, these beliefs were radical. Like, it's a lot less courageous of me to be a Christian nowadays than it would have been for them, because for them, like, it's a 1-year-old religion. Like, Jesus had just died. It was a much smaller community, so these people were radicals at the time. So. No, definitely. I definitely agree with you, Phil.
Indeed. And by the way, I don't know if I said that at the beginning. As we talk about this, we'll talk about all aspects and we will dissect it. But, at the same time, please don't take this for bullshit religious dogma or like Sunday school or this and that. But obviously, we can't talk about this movie without talking and comparing it to the Bible and everything else. So, anyway, Joseph Fiennes, Marisa.
I enjoyed him. As you know, I'm a big fan of Shakespeare in Love, in which we also did an anatomy dissection of him. But his roles that he plays when he has to fight, and he was also in Camelot, which no one saw, which was amazing. Everyone
He was
needs to go
enemy
see
at the
that.
gate. He was with the, he had a sniper in
Enemy
that
of
case.
Gate,
But
like, he can play a really violent, vicious guy, but also on the flip side, a very vulnerable guy that you just love. And it's so great to have someone who's so conflicted character portrayed by someone who can show both sides of those two extremes.
Definitely.
And what I like obviously I think, it's unclear to me whether or not he knew the history beforehand or how much of this was research versus knowledge going into it. But he seems to know and have followed all the various iterations in the movies. The Robe that I mentioned, he's seen The Robe. And he cites Robert Powell and Ted Neely as his favorite actors to have played Jesus in various roles.
Yes. Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
By Robert
And
Powell.
we will definitely talk about
we'll
that.
Get
So the other character that's in this movie, and it's quite an unfortunate thing because so many just shallow people will make the Tom Felton plays Lucius, and yes, of course, Lucius was the name of his father in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Can you imagine how many jokes that kid had to endure on set?
I'm sure a lot. I mean, I even brought it up before the show. So
I was so tempted in the theater. I just saw this movie. When he made his first success and found the apostles, I wanted to go, 10 points for Slytherin. But I refrained.
that's terrible.
I know. I will say, though, he
But
was great.
it is unfortunate. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it is that it's just tough. I mean, especially for that, like, to be in such a successful franchise, 8 films, like, literally, this is your entire childhood, and you know, as he grows older and does more movies like this and whatever else, then yes, the stigma of being Malfoy will eventually, hopefully, subside. But yeah, right now, that's, you know, he's got Rise of the Planet of the Apes and he's got this.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, it's good for Tom Felton to, you know, branch out in different aspects, because he was in Anna and the King before Harry Potter, so like he has a well-established career just in acting, whether it be from film or television too, because I believe he's in Murder in the First. And
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, so like he's a good actor himself. Granted, everyone knows him as Malfoy, which is fine, but I don't think that's a testament to his acting. I think it was very believable that he was so intrigued by Clavius. His character was so intrigued by Clavius that he worked himself into the system to work with Clavius on a day-to-day basis. And you saw him as an idol. Like, he saw Clavius as an idol. It's like, that's who I want to be. You are my inspiration and aspiration to be what I want to be. And I believed it to the point where I thought he could be the new Clavius now that Clavius is no longer the hard-hitting tribune that we knew him to be.
Yeah, and from a
He's the new
casting,
Clavius.
sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, from a casting perspective, it was a really smart move, because if we look at the character of Malfoy, because it's hard to sometimes get out of that, there are a lot of similarities between what was his character's name? Lucius, of course. We just talked about this. Between Lucius and Malfoy, in the fact that he's like a student of. Because if you look at the relationship between Professor Snape and Malfoy in the movies, it's kind of the same dynamic of like a role model, idol figure, a disciple, really, if we're going to use that word. And it was interesting because in the Harry Potter movies, he kind of blindly follows Snape and feels betrayed when he finds out who Snape really is. And the same thing happens in this movie. So props to the casting directors for actually seeing that connection, because they knew he could play that kind of tortured student character really well, I thought, and it worked.
And, you know, Marisa brought up a good point, too. Like, it almost seems like this is the natural succession of it all, because it just felt like in Clavius' time, he's seeing people defect, and he's had to be the one to bring it to justice, or, you know, their definition of justice. And that's why the scene, to me, when Clavius puts the knife or the dagger or the sword, whatever length you want to call it, to Lucius's throat and says, you know, no one dies here today, and then kind of lets him go. Because I feel like he's been in that certain situation, but instead he's been the young guy that's had to put down the older, defected Roman. But in this instance, because of that fact, he knew from the character's point of view how to play it so that no blood was indeed spilled.
It was a good scene.
Yeah,
I liked it.
Yeah.
And I think that was definitely the highlight of his character, because it was a slow buildup of Lucius to the point where he respected his idol so much that he went along with it and fulfilled his wishes. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah.
Indeed. So let's talk about Peter Firth, who plays Pontius
Pilate.
Pontius Pilate, yes.
Yes.
I thought he brought, because there's so much written about this character.
Right.
And the whole notion is that, is he the one that, you know, ultimately wanted Jesus and what,
to be executed?
Exactly. And then, you know, because then you could see, like, you know, towards the end of his life, he probably, like, wanted to switch that history around so he didn't have that on his hands and so forth. So to take a character like this that could be so torn in so many different ways, and whether it's the writing and the way Peter did it, I thought just brought such richness to this character.
Agreed. Yeah. It's funny. I think history kind of vilifies Pontius Pilate, but I actually think if you read the Bible,
actually, Pontius Pilate he himself was even distraught by the fact that the own people of Jerusalem were the ones who wanted to crucify Jesus, Yahshua, and there was the whole scene where Pontius washes his hands because it's literally him telling everyone's like, I'm not responsible for this decision. This is on you. I'm just the one that's actually enforcing it.
Yeah, and I was so glad that the movie painted us a complex portrait of Pontius Pilate because it could have been really reductive. And I feel like he is the perfect example of like, almost like a state senator who's beholden to his president, like his government, and has to listen to the will of the people and the will of his governor. And in his role, policy and politics mean everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't have sympathy for the plight of the Jews or these new emerging Christians. And he was a man tortured by like establishment versus this whatever's happening. And it was interesting to watch.
I feel like Pontius Pilate was always a person stuck between a rock and a hard place. And we also saw that in this film too, because like the Sanhedrin council were also breathing down Pontius Pilate's back for the body too. So and I liked that device too in storytelling because it felt like, hey, there's a time pressure. We have to find the body within so many amount of days before it's too late. So back to Pontius is that like he was always at the will of someone else, not himself.
Yeah, and what's fun about that too is nobody, again, they kind of went to him, but nobody was willing to take the responsibility for anything of it. It was like, okay, no, the Romans have to do this. It's like, well, if you could see him kind of having that frustration of like, if you give a crap about any of this, take care of it yourself.
Right.
It's like, no, you must do it.
That's your plight every day, Phil.
And so, and again, what I liked about it is it takes all of these things that, however you've heard them, part of what I think the perhaps for the non-believers is that it's just so far removed from reality, whether by design or not, that if you kind of say like, okay, yes, they were miracles, but nonetheless they did exist in a real human context, then you go, okay, yeah, that can make me question things a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so I thought he was a very integral portion of making that happen.
And Peter Firth was great casting. I thought he really carried the role well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think the physicality was certainly there. He was someone not to be messed with, but yeah, I think he did a great job as Pontius.
Yeah, and like I said, I've mentioned that bathtub scene, but just the way he just wants to get done with his day.
Right.
And he has a very when he hears, because Clavius is not one, as we've mentioned, he's been around, he knows the truth of it all, and uses that knowledge of these various things down to like even the crucifixion. Like, have you ever seen a crucifixion? Right? And then he throws one of the nails. I forget which one of the apostles.
Bartholomew.
That's it. So he's not an arrogant character, but in that bathtub scene, Clavius is almost there. It's a naivete. It's this hope, and that here's I'm never going to be able to say the name.
Oh, Bartholomew?
No, Pontius. He's almost laughing at him for having that hope of like, you know better,
right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? You're just jibber jabbering.
You'll be just as jaded as me in 20 years once you continue in government.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
So I like those aspects of it 100%.
It's funny. One thing I've always noticed is that these period pieces where they speak English, they always cast British actors because we feel closer to like a foreign place if we know they're not speaking American English because it's more historical. I really want to see what it would be like to see one of these movies where people are like, Pontius, we can't find the body. You know what I mean? Can you imagine if they were to do one of these historical period pieces with American accents? It's never been done.
Well, here's, interesting you bring that up. Right, I didn't touch upon this, but a lot of people are actually touting the way it was cast in general, right? And we're going to talk about Yahshua in just a second. But the Romans were white, and then everyone else has ethnicity.
Right.
Now, yes, you could say, okay, they could have gone maybe a little bit further, but overall, I think, rather than just making everyone white, I think they did a pretty good job. And, the Romans have to be white because they were white.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, Jeff, I didn't really see it as, it was, British people portraying people with American accents. I didn't see that at all. I saw it as like talent. And I think we also covered this in the, what was the
Jesus of Nazareth?
The Gods of...
Yes, we haven't done one of those yet. Which one?
What was these Gods of War that we did like a year ago? That...
no?
No, Exodus.
Exodus, that's it. Haha. Thank you. But a lot of people had backlash for that one, considering like the casting, and they said they whitewashed the cast, which again, and I say it again in this show, I don't see it as this person is white or that. I saw it as talent portraying a certain character.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting part, I was going to talk about this later, but might as well just talk about it now. There are religious groups, and there's one in particular that let me find, but that actually had a lot of problems with Exodus, both from perhaps that perspective, but in general how religion was portrayed, and they gave this movie a stamp of approval, wherever
good.
That may be. It's somewhere in my notes. And by the way, for those of you tuning in, feel free to download the rundown. It has all fun tidbits that we talk about, sometimes ones that we gloss over a little bit more, you can dig deeper into. You just click in the description, download the rundown. It's got the photos and the videos that we share. So I'm not seeing it at the moment, but
We'll get to it.
take my word as gospel.
Nice.
So.
There you go.
But let's talk about Cliff Curtis as Yahshua, because one of the fun comparisons of all of this, the most, Jesus of Nazareth is for me the one that I'm most familiar with, and that is kind of the more iconic view that I've been presented with in terms of Jesus, the blonde, blue-eyed,
Right.
doughy.
The Aryan Jesus.
Yes. And this is not, so much so that he's never even called Jesus, which, at first, I will admit, it took a bit of getting used to, but it was a great device.
Right.
So let's talk about Cliff Curtis.
I think it's interesting. When I saw him first on the screen, I could totally believe that he was Jesus because also he was covered in blood. But I didn't really see the physicality as much as an issue. I saw, again, just another person who's talented, who has somewhat of the physical looks because they are in Jerusalem. They're in their Nazareth. And the races and people can be ethnically ambiguous, which I'm okay with, especially for this film.
Right.
So, and what I liked during the research is that Cliff Curtis, he always wanted to be an actor, but one of the roles he always wanted to play was Jesus. But it was to the point where he himself thought he wanted it so bad, like just growing up, he jokingly wanted to be Jesus. And then when they called him for this role, he thought they were actually joking with him. We were like, really? This is actually a dream come true. I'm actually going to play Jesus, Yahshua, and I found that actually funny because if you want something long enough, eventually you might actually get it.
Yeah. And I really liked the way this Jesus was written, too, because I feel like, and it was partly the way Cliff Curtis played him, and granted, he was arguably a secondary character. Like, this movie wasn't really about Jesus. It was about...
that's what I was saying,
right.
Really. It was more so Clavius, and
For
Jesus
sure.
just happened to be there.
But the scenes where we did get to see Jesus talk, he was presented as a very open-minded, good listener. And and I feel like that's at least like the Jesus that, I don't know, I just felt like it was, he didn't come across as authoritative and extremely, it was more just like, tell me what's on your heart, I think is what he said.
He felt more Socratic.
Yeah, I guess that's the right
The
word.
Socratic method.
Which is kind of, I think, the type of Jesus that the Bible at least is trying to paint. I don't know. What were you going to say, Phil?
No, I was just, speaking of his ethnicities, he's played a Colombian in Blow, an Arab in Three Kings, a Latino in Training Day, and Runaway Journey, and a drug dealer of ambiguous ethnicity in Bringing Out the Dead.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
So, he's played quite the range.
Who did he play in Blow? Was it just an ambiguous Colombian, or?
I forget. I haven't seen that movie.
I love that movie, but
you know, and speaking of that, like the interesting part was he became very quiet on set because he didn't have so much dialogue. He's a little bit more method, and so he went along with that, and he wanted to make sure that he wasn't speaking a lot. So much so that it almost gave people an eerie look because they started like looking at him because he had that almost physical representation of really being Jesus, and they're like, oh.
Well, you gotta think, as an actor, the stakes are high if you're playing Jesus. I mean, if you put in a bad performance, who knows what the spiritual consequences are, right?
Yeah. And more to that, there was an interview where Cliff Curtis also said that he went 40 days without speaking to anyone.
Wow. Yeah. It's his version of the fast.
And he would, when during filming and during the times and scenes where he was actually with Joseph Fiennes, their first actual interaction was when they were sitting together on the rock and having their heart-to-heart discussion. I think that was the first time they actually physically interacted, because they'd be filming and during the same time, literally on set, but they would walk by each other but never really acknowledge someone like, "Hi, how are you doing today?" Like Cliff would purposely not say anything.
Wow.
And so to make their first interaction on screen actually more genuine, I think it worked.
Yeah.
I think it worked too, because and again, that whole scene at the end, you could have just seen it go so didactic of like, "Hey, I'm finally glad you're
right."
See, but I think it was just such an economy of words, and then to say like, "Hey, you've already seen." What I like about the brilliance is this: you can have any two people in the entire world see the same thing and still not agree on what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so that it's taking that notion of it, saying, wow, you've already seen all these miracles and yet you still doubt. Now imagine all the people in the world, and this is what's great about it, is that it's a device to really be talking to the audience that will never get to see these miracles, the doubt that they must be going through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And boom, and that's it. And you didn't need to go further than that. I thought it was just brilliant.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Definitely.
So let's talk about the other characters. Who kind of stood out to you? Whether the apostles, obviously there's Mary, so we can talk about her.
I really enjoyed Mary Magdalene, because in every portrayal of any story about Jesus, that Mary is the person you always feel for the most, because she's always conflicted. The world is always against her. Men are always against her, and she's just always fighting back. But she is such a strong woman at the end of the day. And I still felt for her, because we had that moment of vulnerability and she really, at this point during the story, like, she's so devoted to the apostles and to Jesus that I believed her. Mm-hmm. And no matter what people threw at her, like, you have to tell me where he is, she didn't really care. Yeah. And I like that. She was a very strong woman compared to all the other men who were also present there. She really stood out.
Honestly, all of the minor characters were really well cast. Like, I didn't think there was a bad performance in this movie, which made it enjoyable. Because with these investigation movies, it's a mystery film at the beginning. There's a lot of,
It's Law and Order, Roman times.
Exactly, yeah. But there's the structure just inherently necessitates that you're meeting new people a lot. Like a lot of like ones. That's how Spotlight was too. And all of these performances were great. And I loved, especially the one that stood out to me the most was in the bar, when he meets with the second guard, who looks exactly like Mark Ruffalo.
Mark Ruffalo.
That's what Marisa and I were talking about. I kept being like, it's not Mark. Mark Ruffalo wouldn't do a movie like this. But
it could be his younger brother.
I thought the resemblance was crazy. But that performance was amazing, I thought. When
Fantastic.
Because, like, in his situation, he is so conflicted because he thinks he saw something incredible. But to say that would make him ostracized and potentially killed for heresy. And
plus, he was.
He was drunk for it.
Well, he was also paid off in theory, like to lie.
Say something else
and to be drunk ultimately.
I know.
What I liked about, especially this film and that scene, is that there hasn't been a lot of portrayals of the actual guards' perspective on what happened during it. It's like, we know that the guards were there, and like no one else was like, maybe they just slipped up and that was it.
Right.
And to actually have a moment where the guards is trying to relive and rehash and reiterate what happened, I felt that very, because he couldn't even put it into words.
Right.
and his description of how everything that happened, like, okay, yeah, that's what we know in the Bible. That's what he saw. But I really liked it because there hasn't been a lot of portrayals of that particular moment.
Yeah, and he would be tortured in that position.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do want to go back to Mary Magdalene for a second because, obviously she's so important. She's one of our only female characters in this entire piece. And it's always so interesting to me how she's kind of portrayed as a prostitute. And what I liked about this movie is that comes into question, but at the same time, you can also, I think it's just a very rude rumor, because ultimately I never got that sense from her. Mm-hmm. She was just this, she was just a follower of Yahshua's since the beginning, and there she was. Mm-hmm. And people kind of, it just seemed like, just because she hung out with all these men, rumors started formulating, but she didn't care because she knew the truth.
Yeah.
Right.
I did like how they did have to, remind the audience, like, this is who Mary is. And there was that one moment, it's like, do you all know who Mary Magdalene is? And everyone rose their hand. So there was that moment, like, yeah, we know who she is.
Right.
I thought that was just a funny nod.
I did too, yeah. But what I like about what you were saying, Phil, was like, historically, despite her reputation, Yahshua saw past that, because that's the kind of guy he was at the time. Obviously, that's why there's a whole religion based on him now. And so, too, did the film portray her in that way, where the audience sees her not as a prostitute, but as someone, a passionate follower.
Yeah.
Which was cool.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the apostles. The one that I was able to get the most sort of research on was Peter and Bartholomew, just because they're kind of more prevalent in the movie. But
that would make sense because maybe we'll go to Bartholomew first. Bartholomew was the first and only apostle that really verbally announced his doubt and that this was actually Jesus / Yahshua that came back. And there was the whole, he was conflicted to the point where he, walked away and he's like, I don't believe this.
Wasn't that Thomas? I thought that was Thomas.
They actually go in two different, there's apostles, they have two different names.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, so that was Thomas.
Thomas, yeah.
But okay, kind of like how Simon and Peter. Okay,
Simon
I thought
Peter,
so because that was
they
what
have
I was
double
thinking.
names.
Right.
And no, it does get confusing.
Saul and Paul,
Yeah.
Simon and Peter.
Matthias,
Come on, just pick Yahshua and
Matthias
Jesus.
and so many different names.
Yeah.
But yes, he was the one who actually verbally speaks out his doubt. And so it would make sense that he would get some screen time during that moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He was great. Great performance. Definitely.
Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought Peter was the other one that I thought was very prevalent. I thought he did a very good job. Stuart Scudamore?
Scudamore?
There you go. Of Irish, Scottish, English descent. A little bit of Greek in there. A little bit of Greek.
Nice.
That's his descent. I thought he did well with it. And those guys, what was so good, right? One of the things that we didn't talk about, they need to work on a whole. As much as they're individuals, and you can kind of have an individual you could have explored that way, if they don't have cohesion and joy together, because again, everyone's an individual in that regard, but they seem to hit the same highs and lows in some degree. So when they're on that boat and they're fishing and nothing's coming up, they're all in that low together. And then to see that miracle of all these fish, it becomes a collective joyous moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that because just off of biblical reference that it makes sense that Peter would be the most elated during that moment because the first time Peter ever met Jesus, he was fishing and he was having a bad fishing day. He literally was out there for hours and he caught nothing. And then he met Jesus and Jesus was like, let's go back out there. And Jesus prayed and then he got a bunch of fish. And so I like this is technically the second time, or they fished a lot more than that, but the second big moment where they weren't getting anything, no fish. And then he saw Jesus, yes, Jesus is here, we definitely have fish again. So it just kind of relates back to the first time. Mm-hmm. So it shows just that connection with Peter and Jesus.
Fair enough. And this is going to be a poor choice of words. But let's talk about all the Easter eggs.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome.
I want to know where Easter eggs ultimately came. Well,
hidden secrets.
Hidden.
I think
yeah, there you go. See,
little surprises.
You know what Easter eggs are. You go and find them. They're hidden.
well, there you go. So let's talk about all the Easter eggs in this movie. I thought, one of the ones that stood out for me was the temple cracking.
Yes.
It's not really brought a lot of attention to, but at the same time it happens and it's significant.
Yeah, definitely. I think the moment of Jesus' death, like the exact moment of the termination of the crucifixion, is huge biblically because it represents essentially the birth of the Christian church. And like if we're getting theological, it represents the destruction of kind of the barrier between us and God, because before Christ's death, corresponding and like communing with God was there was kind of a lot of technicalities and kind of hurdles that you had to go through. And the idea was that Jesus came to die so that those would all be erased and we could have a direct kind of relationship with God. So I'm glad it seemed true to the text that they would point to that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I really liked it because we saw the end result first before now what we knew in the Bible, because we saw the earthquake and the guys didn't really think much of it. And as an audience member, I didn't think much of it either. And then we got the context that, they're at the crucifixion, Jesus just died. And I was like, oh, yes, because that does happen. Because literally the moment it dies, there was an earthquake.
Right.
So I was like, it makes sense. So, yes, religious context.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, just it's that religious context, but at the same time, it applies it to, for lack of a better term, a real world setting. Because you can so be in that, how many times do things happen in our own kind of world, and you can contextualize, that's just this, and so you can literally see signs in front of you all day long, but never really see them.
But never really think about it.
For sure.
What else was there? You guys are the religious sector of this podcast, so whatever things stood out to you guys most. Again, I thought in terms of the story of it, they hit the beats really well.
I liked how that, just for story context and whatnot, that after they fled from the Roman soldiers and they're like, Jesus said, let's go to Galilee. And I was like, because they did. And then I had to remember, this was actually a span of 40 days.
Right.
Because in film, it looked like the span of maybe 4 days. And I was like, oh no, this is like a month and a half long process. So I liked how we did take that time and journey throughout, going from one place to the next, getting away from everybody, and just being isolated with Jesus.
I think in general, too, I was glad that it just captured the magnitude of this moment in the history of Christianity, because I think when you're reading any historical text that's 2,000 years old, it can sometimes be hard to visualize and realize kind of the importance and stakes of what's happening for any story. So it was nice that like the filmmakers and the acting and everything realized that this was a huge pivotal turning point in the church and really captured the stakes of what would happen if Christ's body wasn't recovered. So I think just in general, they got that right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've mentioned it. Kevin Reynolds wanted that to be a piece. He wanted to appeal to both believers and non-believers. And if you look at it, let's talk about Kevin Reynolds. He signed on back in 2013. So, that's almost a 3-year process that it's taken for Kevin Reynolds to be involved with this. And as I mentioned, he's been around. He's collaborated a lot with Kevin Costner, whether it was Waterworld, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Hatfields and McCoy. So
Count of Monte Cristo.
There you go.
Yeah. And Hatfields and McCoy's was great.
Yeah.
All of these were, but that was like...
Well, with the exception of Water, most people disagree on Waterworld.
Right, yeah. But yeah, he's got quite a resume.
And I liked it was also Kevin Reynolds' idea, because he did help write the screenplay. It was his idea to have the story be told from a non-believer perspective. Which opened the door to so many more people to watch this film.
Well, yeah, and you can tell, like, based on his resume, that Kevin Reynolds is interested in history from a historical context. Because Hatfields and McCoy's isn't an agenda miniseries. It's just a historical. So he just wants to tell important stories that happened in the past, I think. And this, I think, goes right along with that theme.
And I actually, I don't think history has been the most kind to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but I actually enjoy that.
Me too. It's a fun one.
So I can't take anything away from him. And I thought the stuff that he brought to this, and the fact that, there's not too much written fully about Paul, but the fact that this is literally Paul's first script, and to have someone like Kevin Reynolds be there to guide him in this entire process, and also someone who knows, like a $20 million. We just talked about race and how they used a $5 million budget to create that, and now you're kind of creating a whole separate world, right? You have to go a couple thousands of years into the past, and so they had a budget of about $20 million. I thought they were able to stretch it out fantastically well for that budget to create this world.
And I thought maybe getting into the production aspect, that like the physical environment that they were in, I really felt like we were in Jerusalem in the dusty, dirty streets. And it was like even the Roman Empire when we were there. So like the different locations. And then when they're fleeing away from everybody down into the caves, rocky, pits, whatnot. The location aspect, it shows such a high production value that maybe it also just reflects the story that it takes people all over the world, and it took them all over that area. So
where was this shot? I couldn't find.
Some places were in Malta, and the southern Spain.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it looks great. I agree with both you guys.
It did look fantastic, and the other part that interested me too was. There was a nice, well, at least the cinematographer, right? I can't speak to necessarily everyone else in that respect, but the cinematographer Lorenzo Senatore, he's honestly known for the biggest Wrong Turn 3, Lake Placid 2, as a cinematographer, but he's done a lot of second unit and Steadicam work on movies such as 300, Rise of an Empire, Hercules, Expendables, and so it felt nice to me that in this scenario, I thought the cinematography was done really well.
Me too.
And so for him, I'm happy for him because he got his shot to really shine.
Yeah.
I thought he did really well.
I loved there were some shots that really showcased the environment that they were in, and it perfectly blocked everyone, and is where you can see everyone clearly on screen. And then there was like a beautiful sunset that never gets old looking at, and I think he really encapsulated that world that they were living in a beautiful way, because there were moments where they were just out there just talking to each other, enjoying their presence, and it was just shown so beautifully.
I was kind of taken aback by those shots of them on the boat at night, the silhouettes of the boat and the starry sky, and then how, I don't know whose call this would be from a production standpoint, but to have the shot of the net entering the water and then coming up. I just feel like there was a lot of specific cinematography. Just choices that were made from a cinematography standpoint that were really smart and also like very beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, Phil. That's nice. I'd like to see some more Lorenzo Senatore in the future. Hopefully we will.
That sunset was amazing.
Yeah.
It's like they had an awesome day to film that scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, and here's the thing. You could say it's gratuitous cinematography, and not in the sense that it might come to mind too, but that, okay, did you really need that? But if you look at it from a symbolic standpoint of, as Marisa said, that the whole point of this is that the world has natural beauty as created by God, then, that's what you're supposed to enjoy. And from a cinematography standpoint, you're only enforcing that.
Right. Mm-hmm. And if it's about an internal journey, sometimes the only way to express that is through the shots that you're seeing, because we can't physically get inside of Clavius's mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. The editing, I thought again, all these things, I don't think they're going to get the recognition that they deserve just because they serve the story so well that they just don't stand out. But again, without them being really good, the movie wouldn't be as good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I thought the editing pacing shifted here and there, but in a good way, because at the beginning of the film we did get a battle scene, so that was like very fast paced. We got the audience into the film, and then when they're doing the whole interrogation scenes with everyone, it slowed down a bit. They felt very procedural and trial and whatnot. And then when they're running away, it picked up the pace again. So I felt like the editing was fast at moments and slow at others, but I still kept my attention the whole film.
They say the best edited movies, you don't notice the editing, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with you guys.
And then, the fact that it comes in pretty much in an hour and 40. To me, this is a biblical epic, but biblical epics can also, they have that notion of, it's a 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie.
Yeah.
So,
It's a 4-hour movie, really.
Jesus of Nazareth, that's 7 hours.
7 hours. But in fairness, that was a series, so.
Fair enough. But still, and the fact that they had, again, the economy of words, the economy of shot selection, the economy of story, it's a simple story told really, really well. By the way, the composer for this, Rocky Baños, did The Machinist, Evil Dead, and Sexy Beast, and I wanted to specifically bring up that because Sexy Beast is a fantastic movie that I don't think enough people have seen, but should.
I like The Machinist too, definitely. The score was great. I thought it fit, it set the tone, never distracted me. I don't know what you guys think, but
I liked it. I think the moment where I really noticed it was during the Ascension. Where he walked away and there was literally like no words to be spoken. I think visually it showed with the sunrise, and then in music it's just like everyone can feel what we should be feeling. Like this is a moment of complete utter joy.
Yeah,
indeed. All right, so where did this movie end up? Well, pre-tracking had it coming in at 17 to 12 million from almost 3,000 theaters. Well, the good news is
that's a lot.
As of February 24th, it has grossed 14.9 million already.
It's risen.
It has risen. And right now, the worldwide total is about 15 million.
And the budget was 20?
The budget was 20.
Okay.
So they'll make its money back.
I think so, yeah.
I think that's really good, especially for just being the first week. And I think the only religious holiday that you could tie this to would be the Lent. Ash Wednesday just happened fairly recently, putting timestamp on this show. But because we were not in the Easter moment yet, so maybe had they waited another month, it might have brought a lot more of the Christian-based demographic to this. But I think that it's doing fine on its own.
Yeah.
Well, later on, there's too much. Batman versus Superman is coming out.
I think
It'd be
too.
competing with others.
This is the kind of movie that could do really well, like in DVD sales, and I just feel like this is the kind of movie a lot of like parents will buy their children, and like I used to shop in Christian bookstores when I was a kid, and like I feel like this is the kind of movie you'd see on the. I don't know. It's just I think from a marketing standpoint, it can be really smart to like niche into an audience because you can get really good post-release sales on those.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, this is another movie that unfortunately suffers in the critic department, coming in at a 57%, which isn't terrible, based off of 81 reviews. However, the cinema score is an A-.
Yeah, audience like it.
The audience is liking it. I personally went in with a fairly, I don't want to say high expectations, but a fairly open mind. And I walked out of it, and I'm Catholic. And I walked out of it, I was like, hey, I actually enjoyed it.
Let me ask you this. Well, the one kind of criticism that is for me warranted is this got a PG-13. It can be brutal at times.
It can be.
And what was the article? Sun, right? Times.
Oh,
so
no.
I'm not saying sometimes. There's an article that they wrote and they joked about, well, at least the MPA is consistent in its embrace of violence over sex and language.
Yeah. I know Europeans view American cinema as like so prudish sexually, but so gratuitous violently, whereas we have the opposite view towards kind of like European cinema. So I think it's It's a criticism that's hard for us to probably contextualize because we're from the United States. But whenever it's raised, I can definitely see why there's some validity to those points.
Well, and there's also there were some visually gruesome moments on the screen. There was a battle. We saw violence and death and gore, and then even when they're excavating all the bodies, they're all deteriorating and nasty just to look at. Like, I'm sure a 12-year-old kid probably wouldn't want to watch that.
Yeah.
Well, he's got to be at least 13.
Yeah, exactly. So this 12-year-old can't
So no
watch
one
it.
under 13 will be watching this movie because everyone knows that only 13-year-olds and over go to PG-13
yeah,
movies.
there are some visually gruesome moments.
For sure. And there should have been. I think
that warrant this rating.
Exactly. It would have been disingenuous to tell this story without brutality because crucifixion is the most brutal way to end someone's life. So it was true, which it should have been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way, one of the fun facts. I think it was Bartholomew. He refused when he was crucified. He refused to be crucified he did it upside
As
down. Peter. That's
Yeah.
right. There you go.
Because Peter says he was not good enough
to be crucified.
Exactly like Jesus.
Yeah.
I found that interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the overall it of it. Like I said, I'm excited to see how it does this weekend and further weekends. And the fact that audiences do like it, I think bodes well, and we'll see. It doesn't have a far to reach its production budget, which is great. And I thought they all did a fantastic job. I really do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
I like for a story that's been told 1.5 million ways, 1.5 million different times, that this was a fresh, new take on the same story. And that's what's always, inviting and something to look forward to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's the great thing about film in and of itself, or cinema telling, is that you can make it interesting, and they certainly did. So.
All right, final thoughts on the movie. Anything we haven't talked about yet that you absolutely are dying to get out to the audience?
I just think this is an example of a movie where, if everything works, I think some movies, acting is great, but there's a problem with the story or whatever. This is an example of a movie where the acting, the script, the editing, everything was all good enough to make this movie good. There was nothing, even the small performances of the minor characters were strong. So, filmmaking is so collaborative, and everything worked well enough to make this a good movie in my mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, and I don't want to end on a bad note because I did actually really enjoy this. My one caveat, or maybe two caveats, is during the miracles that happened, I felt they were too safe. And, they had a fairly bigger production budget for $20 million. They had some money to play around with, but the leper scene with him healing the leper, it's I kind of wanted just to see a visual him actually healing, and we actually cut away from someone in heavily make-upped attire to someone who's completely normal. And it's they could have done something visually interesting to actually witness a miracle, but they didn't show us. So I guess it allowed the audience to use their imaginations for that. And then the whole ascension scene, I thought that was way too simple.
Did you?
Yeah, he walked into a big ball of light, and then there was a sound effect. You have some money, you can show something a little bit
How do
more
you
than
know that isn't what happened?
Right.
I know, but...
there you are, wanting something more than...
I wanted a little bit more, only because this is film, and this is the perfect platform to actually showcase something as grand as a moment that was. And it wasn't so grand. It was just someone walking into light. I can walk into light every single day.
But I think the problem, I think they made again, whether you disagree with it, that's fine. I think people are entitled to that. But I think they made a very deliberate choice in wanting to just be yes, it's spiritual, but to be as secular about that spirituality as they could be. And so to have the God equivalent of Simba's father in the sky, come to me, Yahshua, you are now going to come on. Come on.
That would have been great.
And hopefully no one found that sacrilegious in any way, shape, or form.
I'm just saying.
I'm glad I'm good thanks to you, Jeff.
Oh, I think God can laugh. I think he's got a sense of humor.
Yeah, for grand moments, I felt it could have been a little bit more grander. Maybe because I just, I know these stories. I grew up with them, and I was just expecting something a little bit more. But overall, I did enjoy the film.
Fair enough. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and hopefully you guys found this entertaining, that we could go in depth, that we could have fun with it for a serious movie like this. Hopefully you guys appreciate it. Like I said, we're not here to change your views about any of it. What we wanted to do was strictly talk about this movie.
Yes.
But you know what? Feel free to, if you have disagreements and things like that, or whatever else, whether about the movie, whether about religion, just put it in the comments. That's what they're there for. And as mentioned, our entire rundown, along with the photos that we used throughout this episode, are there to download for you. So even if you were listening on iTunes or anywhere else in terms of the audio platforms, you're not excluded. So, check those out, and thank you guys for joining us. We try to strive and make a better product for you guys every time. So if you haven't rated or commented in a while, let us know. It really does let us it's a nice reality check of where we're at, how we're doing, so we can adjust. In the meantime, Jeff Graham, where can people interact?
Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I love doing these anatomies when I get to. You can find me on Twitter at Jeffrey C. Graham, and you can find me on Instagram at Jeffrey Crane Graham.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Serafini TV.
And follow us here at The Popcorn Talk and at Movie Anatomy. We've got so many movies coming down the pipeline. 999 next week, as well as Eddie the Eagle. We just did Race. As mentioned, we've done Hail Caesar. We did Deadpool a couple weeks ago, so if
we also did Shakespeare in Love, too, if you want to go back to that.
There you go. We did Shakespeare in Love. So we did Exodus, so if you happen to like that movie, that could be a great comparison. One of the movies that wasn't mentioned in our dissection, but it was in the notes, was Noah. We did Noah. So feel free to kind of compare and contrast those. I think that's a fun exercise as well that, we just unfortunately don't have time for fully in these episodes. And especially because then that just assumes that you've seen all these movies, which unfortunately is not always the case and unfair to do so. But thank you for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully next time. Bye for now.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the rest of the Anatomy of a Movie staff, we would like to thank you for listening and subscribing to the show. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email or tweet us. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been Anatomy of a Movie.